Sometimes the most ordinary moments can change everything we thought we knew about our lives. For 49-year-old Kendra Washington, that moment came during what should have been a peaceful Sunday walk with her 8-year-old son Devon through Magnolia Park. As they approached the old sweetgum tree at the park's edge, Devon suddenly stopped and pointed upward. There, hanging from the ancient branches, was something impossible. A massive cocoon made of twisted roots and Spanish moss, bigger than any person. Devon stepped closer and whispered that something inside was calling his name. When Kendra looked into the cocoon's dark center, she saw a shadow move, something that brought back memories she'd tried to forget from her own childhood. Her grandmother's warnings about this very tree came flooding back, along with stories about family secrets that were supposed to stay buried. But what happens when the past refuses to stay hidden? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Kendra Washington had built her life around routines that kept the past at bay. Every morning at 6:30, she'd wake in her small 2-bedroom house on Elm Street, brew coffee strong enough to wake the ancestors, as her grandmother used to say, and review her day's appointments at the herbal wellness clinic she ran from her converted garage. By 7, she'd have Devon up and ready for breakfast, his school clothes laid out the night before, his backpack checked and double-checked. The clinic had been her sanctuary for the past 5 years, ever since she'd finally saved enough to leave her corporate job and follow what felt like her true calling. The converted space smelled perpetually of lavender, chamomile, and the dried herbs she'd hang in careful bundles from the exposed beams. Clients came seeking relief from everything from chronic pain to sleepless nights. Drawn by word-of-mouth recommendations and Kendra's gentle, knowledgeable approach to natural healing, but it was the leather-bound journal tucked away in her desk drawer that held the real knowledge, her grandmother's recipe book, filled with generations of healing wisdom written in a careful, sloping hand. Kendra had inherited it along with the house when Grandma Ruby passed 3 years ago, though she'd barely opened it since. The recipes inside went beyond simple herbal teas and poultices. They spoke of protection, of spiritual cleansing, of working with forces that modern life had taught her to dismiss as superstition. "Mama, you're burning the eggs again," Devon's voice called from the kitchen. Pulling her from her thoughts, she hurried back to find him standing on the step stool she'd bought him last Christmas, carefully flipping pancakes on the griddle with the serious concentration he brought to everything he did. At 8 years old, Devon possessed an unsettling maturity that often caught adults off guard. His teachers praised his thoughtfulness, his ability to listen and observe before speaking. But Kendra sometimes worried that he'd inherited too much of her own tendency towards solitude. "Thank you, baby," she said, kissing the top of his head. His hair smelled like the coconut oil she massaged into his scalp every Sunday night, a ritual her own mother had abandoned when Kendra was barely older than Devon was now. Devon's father had been a brief chapter in her life, a charming man who disappeared when pregnancy became reality rather than possibility. She'd grieved the loss of the family she'd imagined, but found strength she didn't know she possessed in raising Devon alone. Her grandmother had helped during those early years, providing both practical support and the kind of unconditional love that made anything seem possible. "Mrs. Chen called yesterday," Kendra said, settling into her chair with her coffee. "She wants to bring her arthritis flare-ups under control before her daughter's wedding next month." Devon nodded seriously, as if discussing herbal treatment plans over breakfast was the most natural thing in the world. In their household it was. He'd grown up surrounded by the language of healing, understanding from an early age that plants could be medicine, that the body had its own wisdom if you knew how to listen. The phone rang, interrupting their quiet morning routine. Kendra glanced at the caller ID, blocked number, and let it go to voicemail. Sunday mornings were sacred in their house, protected time before the week's demands took over. After breakfast, Devon retreated to his room to work on a school project about local history, while Kendra reviewed client notes for the coming week. Mrs. Rodriguez would need a new batch of the sleep tea that had finally given her relief from insomnia. Mr. Peterson wanted to try something different for his chronic back pain. Each client represented a small puzzle to solve, a way to match traditional wisdom with individual need. The house on Elm Street had been in her family for 3 generations. Kendra's great-grandmother had bought it in 1952 with money saved from years of domestic work, making her one of the first black families in what was then considered the white part of town. The neighborhood had changed over the decades, becoming more diverse, more welcoming, but the house itself remained a constant, sturdy brick construction, with a wraparound porch and a backyard garden that seemed to grow whatever you planted with minimal effort. Grandma Ruby had always said the land was blessed, that their ancestors had chosen this spot for good reason. As a child, Kendra had rolled her eyes at such talk. As an adult, she'd learned to appreciate the way tomatoes flourished here long past their normal season. How herbs grew more potent in this soil than anywhere else she'd tried to cultivate them. "Mama, can we go to the park today?" Devon appeared in the doorway, his history report apparently finished. Magnolia Park had been their Sunday tradition for as long as Devon could remember. The sprawling green space sat at the edge of town, where suburban neighborhoods gave way to older growth forest. Ancient oak trees provided shade for picnic tables, while a playground kept the younger children occupied. But it was the walking trails that drew Kendra, winding paths that led deeper into the woods, where the sounds of traffic faded and something approaching peace could be found. She'd avoided thinking too much about why the park called to her so strongly. It simply felt like a place where she could breathe fully, where the weight of single motherhood and small business ownership could lift from her shoulders, at least temporarily. Devon seemed to feel it too, though he expressed it differently, running ahead on the trails, then stopping suddenly to examine a particular tree or rock formation with intense focus. "Of course we can go to the park," she said, already looking forward to the afternoon ritual. "Just let me finish these notes." The morning passed in comfortable routine, Kendra organizing her workspace while Devon read quietly in the living room, classical music playing softly from the radio. They developed these rhythms over years of just the two of them, learning to move around each other with the easy familiarity of long-time roommates. By 1 o'clock, they were walking the familiar path into Magnolia Park, Devon running ahead to investigate a butterfly that had caught his attention. Kendra followed more slowly, enjoying the way dappled sunlight filtered through the canopy overhead. Other families dotted the landscape, parents pushing children on swings, teenagers playing frisbee, elderly couples walking hand in hand along the paved paths. It should have been just another peaceful Sunday afternoon. It should have remained unremarkable, forgettable even, the kind of ordinary family outing that blended into all the others. Instead, it became the moment when everything Kendra thought she knew about her life, her family and herself, began to unravel. They were approaching the far edge of the park, where the maintained grounds gave way to wilder growth, when Devon stopped so suddenly that Kendra nearly walked into him. His small body had gone completely still, one hand raised as if listening to something she couldn't hear. "Devon? What is it, honey?" But he didn't answer. He was staring upward at the massive sweetgum tree that marked the boundary between park and forest, the same tree her grandmother had pointed out during their own walks when Kendra was small, always with a warning to stay away, never with an explanation that satisfied a curious child's questions. Now, as she followed her son's gaze upward into the ancient branches, Kendra understood why Grandma Ruby had always spoken of this particular tree with such wariness. Hanging from its highest reaches was something that couldn't exist. Shouldn't exist, but undeniably did. A cocoon larger than any she'd ever seen, woven not from silk, but from what appeared to be roots and Spanish moss, creating an organic pod that pulsed with its own rhythm. And as Devon stepped closer to the base of the tree, his young voice cutting through the Sunday afternoon quiet, Kendra realized that their ordinary life had just become something else entirely. It knows my name. Mama, Devon whispered, his small hand pressed against the rough bark of the sweetgum tree. It's saying my name over and over. Kendra's hands trembled as she pulled out her phone, her thumb hovering over the emergency call button. The cocoon swayed slightly in the breeze, and she could swear she saw movement within its woven depths, not the flutter of an emerging butterfly, but something larger, more deliberate. One. What's your emergency? Kendra's voice caught. How do you explain the impossible? I'm at Magnolia Park with my son, and there's something here that shouldn't be here. Something dangerous. Ma'am, can you be more specific? Are you or your child injured? Kendra looked down at Devon, who remained transfixed by the cocoon, his lips moving as if he were having a conversation she couldn't hear. No, we're not hurt, but there's this structure in one of the trees. It's not natural. I think something might be trapped inside. A structure? Like a treehouse or fort? No, it's... Kendra struggled to find words that wouldn't make her sound delusional. It's like a giant cocoon, but made of roots and moss. And my son says he can hear something inside, calling to him. The silence on the other end stretched long enough that Kendra wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, the dispatcher's voice returned, carefully professional. Ma'am, I'm going to send an officer to check things out. Can you give me your exact location? The walking trail at the far end of Magnolia Park, near the big sweetgum tree at the forest edge. Okay, Officer Martinez is about 10 minutes out. Please stay where you are, and don't let your son approach whatever it is you're seeing. But when Kendra ended the call and looked around, Devon was no longer beside her. He'd moved closer to the tree, his small frame dwarfed by the massive trunk, his head tilted back at an angle that made her neck ache in sympathy. Devon, come back here, she called, but he seemed not to hear her. She approached cautiously. Every instinct her grandmother had ever tried to instill in her, suddenly screaming warnings. The air around the tree felt different, thicker, charged with an energy that made her skin prickle. As she drew closer, the cocoon became even more impossible to dismiss as imagination or trick of light. It hung approximately 15 feet off the ground, suspended from branches that should have broken under its weight. The woven exterior pulsed with a subtle rhythm, like a heartbeat or slow breathing, and there, just visible through gaps in the organic weaving, something dark and shapeless moved. Devon, step away from the tree right now. This time her son heard the authority in her voice and obeyed, but reluctantly. As he moved back to her side, she noticed his pupils were dilated, his breathing shallow and rapid. What did it say to you? She asked, crouching to his eye level. It knows about Grandma Ruby. It remembers her. Devon's voice held a dreamy quality that frightened her. It's been waiting for someone from our family to come back. Before Kendra could respond, the sound of footsteps on the trail announced Officer Martinez's arrival. He was younger than she'd expected, probably in his early 30s, with the kind of skeptical expression that suggested he'd already categorized this as another strange call from an overwrought parent. Ms. Washington, you called about some kind of structure in a tree. Kendra pointed upward, grateful to have an official witness to whatever this was. But when she looked up, her heart sank. The branches of the sweetgum tree were empty, except for a few lingering leaves and strands of Spanish moss moving in the breeze. I don't see anything unusual. Ma'am, Officer Martinez said, following her gaze with obvious confusion, but it was there. Kendra insisted, desperation creeping into her voice. A huge cocoon right there in those branches. My son saw it too. Officer Martinez looked down at Devon, who had gone completely silent, his eyes focused on something in the distance. Son, did you see what your mother is describing? Devon's gaze shifted between his mother and the police officer, and Kendra watched as something closed off in his expression. I saw something, he said carefully, but it's gone now. The officer spent another 10 minutes examining the tree, walking around its base, even shining a flashlight up into the branches despite the afternoon sun. He found nothing unusual, no broken branches, no unusual markings, no evidence that anything out of the ordinary had ever been there. Sometimes shadows and moss can create optical illusions, he said diplomatically as he prepared to leave. especially when you're looking up through tree branches. The mind can play tricks. After he left, Kendra and Devon sat in silence on a nearby park bench. Other families continued their Sunday activities around them, children playing, dogs being walked, couples enjoying the pleasant weather. Normal life proceeding as if nothing had changed. "I know what we saw," Kendra said quietly. Devon nodded, his small hand finding hers. "It's still there, Mama. We just can't see it right now." That night, after Devon had gone to bed, Kendra found herself standing in her kitchen, staring at the drawer where she kept her grandmother's journal. She hadn't opened it in months, preferring to rely on her own accumulated knowledge and the more conventional herbal references she'd studied in college. But her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory. Warnings about the old sweetgum tree that had seemed like outdated superstition until this afternoon. With trembling hands, she pulled out the leather-bound book and opened it to the first page. Written in her grandmother's careful script was a single line that made her blood run cold. "Some things are meant to stay hidden, but they don't stay hidden forever." The rest of that first page contained what looked like a protection ritual, with instructions for gathering specific herbs and performing certain actions when the old bindings begin to fail. Below that, in different ink that suggested it had been added later, was a single word: Devon. Kendra sank into her kitchen chair, the journal heavy in her hands. Her son's name, written in her grandmother's handwriting, on a page about failing bindings and things that were meant to stay hidden. She thought about Devon's behavior at the park, the way he'd seemed to hear something she couldn't, the dreamy quality of his voice, his insistence that whatever they'd seen was still there even when it appeared to be gone. These weren't the imaginings of a creative 8-year-old. They were signs of something else entirely. From upstairs came the sound of Devon talking in his sleep, his voice too quiet for her to make out the words, but animated enough to suggest he was having a conversation. She'd noticed him doing this more frequently over the past few months, always dismissing it as normal childhood behavior. Now, with her grandmother's journal open before her, and the memory of an impossible cocoon fresh in her mind, she wondered what, or whom, her son might be talking to in his dreams. The house settled around her with familiar creaks and sighs, but for the first time since inheriting it, Kendra didn't find the sounds comforting. Instead, they seemed like whispers, like warnings, like reminders that some family legacies couldn't be avoided forever. Tomorrow, she decided, she would start reading her grandmother's journal properly. Tomorrow, she would begin trying to understand what Devon was becoming and what role she was supposed to play in whatever was unfolding. But tonight, she sat in her kitchen until dawn, keeping watch over her sleeping son and wondering how long she could protect him from a heritage she'd never fully understood herself. The next morning brought no relief from the questions that had kept Kendra awake most of the night. Devon seemed normal enough over breakfast, chatting about his upcoming book report, reminding her about his friend Jamie's birthday party next weekend. But she caught him staring out the window toward the direction of Magnolia Park more than once. After dropping him at school, Kendra drove directly to her grandmother's old room, now used primarily for storage. She hadn't been able to bring herself to change much after Grandma Ruby's passing. The antique dresser still held her jewelry and trinkets. The closet still contained clothes that smelled faintly of lavender and something else, something earthy and wild that Kendra had never been able to identify. At the back of the closet, behind winter coats that would never be worn again, Kendra found what she was looking for, a wooden box she remembered from childhood, always kept on her grandmother's nightstand, but never opened in Kendra's presence. Her fingers traced the carved symbols on the lid, spirals and crescents that might have been decorative or might have been something more. Inside, wrapped in faded silk, was a silver locket that had belonged to Kendra's great-grandmother. She'd seen it in old family photographs, but never in person. As she lifted it from the box, the metal felt surprisingly warm against her palm, almost pulsing with its own heat. There were other items, too. A small cloth pouch that rattled with dried seeds or roots, several folded papers covered in her grandmother's handwriting. and a photograph she'd never seen before. It showed a much younger Grandma Ruby standing beside the sweetgum tree in Magnolia Park, her hand pressed against its bark in a gesture that looked both protective and proprietary. The photograph was dated 1963, which would have made her grandmother about Kendra's current age. But it was what she saw in the background that made her breath catch, the unmistakable shape of the cocoon, hanging from the same branches where she and Devon had seen it yesterday. Her hands shaking, Kendra unfolded the first of the papers. It was a letter addressed to her, written in her grandmother's careful script, but dated only 3 months before her death. "My dear granddaughter," it began, "if you are reading this, then the time has come for our family's responsibility to pass to the next generation. I had hoped it might skip you as it skipped your mother, but I see now that Devon carries the gift more strongly than anyone in our line for generations." Kendra's heart hammered as she continued reading. The letter spoke of their family's role as guardians, of a presence that had been bound to the old tree for over a century, of the delicate balance that kept something dangerous contained. Her grandmother wrote about the silver locket, how it would grow warm in the presence of supernatural activity, how it had been passed down through generations of women who carried the responsibility. "Your great-great-grandmother was brought to this land in chains," the letter continued, "but she carried with her the knowledge of the old ways. When she and the other root workers were forced to meet in secret, they chose that tree because it already held power, old power that predated any human presence here. They used that power to protect their community, but power always comes with a price." The letter explained that over time, something had taken residence in the tree, feeding on the spiritual energy of the rituals performed beneath its branches. When it became too dangerous to ignore, the root workers had bound it, trapping it in a prison of woven roots and Spanish moss, the cocoon that Kendra and Devon had witnessed. "The binding must be renewed every generation," her grandmother had written. "I performed the ritual when I was young, as did my mother before me. But your mother chose to turn away from our heritage, and I thought perhaps the gift had died with her rejection. Now I know it was only sleeping, waiting for Devon." Kendra set the letter down with trembling hands and picked up the cloth pouch. When she opened it, the scent that emerged was the same earthy wildness she'd always associated with her grandmother's room. Inside were roots and herbs she recognized from her training, but also others that seemed to pulse with their own energy. The locket around her neck had grown noticeably warmer as she read, and now it seemed almost hot against her skin. She lifted it to examine the intricate engravings more closely and gasped when she realized they matched the symbols carved into the wooden box. A knock at the front door interrupted her exploration. Through the peephole, she saw Mrs. Florence Chen, her elderly neighbor who had lived on Elm Street for nearly as long as Kendra's family. Mrs. Chen had been one of her grandmother's closest friends, and Kendra realized she might be the only person left who could help her understand what she'd discovered. "Good morning, Mrs. Chen. Please come in." The older woman's eyes went immediately to the locket around Kendra's neck, and her expression grew serious. "So it started then. I wondered when I felt the energy shifting yesterday afternoon." Kendra's mouth fell open. "You felt something?" Mrs. Chen settled into Grandma Ruby's favorite armchair, as if she'd been waiting for this conversation her entire life. "Child, your grandmother and I didn't spend all those years drinking tea and gossiping about the neighbors. We were keeping watch, maintaining the balance your family was charged with protecting." Over the next hour, Mrs. Chen filled in the gaps that her grandmother's letter had only hinted at. She spoke of the community of root workers who had used Magnolia Park as their sacred space, of the entity that had slowly grown powerful by feeding on their rituals, of the binding ceremony that had contained it for decades. "Your grandmother was barely 18 when she had to renew the binding," Mrs. Chen explained. "Scared out of her mind, but determined to protect everyone she loved. She made me promise that if anything ever happened to her, I would help guide the next guardian. But why didn't she tell me any of this when she was alive?" Mrs. Chen's smile was sad but understanding. because she hoped it wouldn't be necessary. Your mother's rejection of the gift was so complete, so final, that Ruby thought maybe the line had ended with her. She didn't want to burden you with knowledge you might never need. And Devon is something special, Mrs. Chen said, her voice filled with a mixture of pride and concern. The gift skipped your mother's generation entirely, which means it's been building, concentrating. He's probably more sensitive than any guardian before him. As if summoned by their conversation, Kendra's phone buzzed with a call from Devon's school. Her heart sank as she heard the concern in his teacher's voice. "Ms. Washington, I think you should come pick up Devon. He's been unusual today. He keeps saying he can hear someone calling him, and he's drawn pictures that have some of the other children frightened." Kendra was already reaching for her keys. "I'll be right there." Mrs. Chen stood as well, her movements careful but determined. "I'm coming with you." It's time Devon met someone who understands what he's experiencing. During the drive to school, Mrs. Chen explained more about what they might expect. The entity in the tree has been contained for so long that most people can't sense it anymore. But children with the gift, especially one as strong as Devon's, they're like beacons to it. It will try to call him, to use his power to weaken the binding. How do we stop it? We teach him to control his abilities instead of being controlled by them. And we prepare for the possibility that the old binding might not hold much longer. When they arrived at the school, Devon was sitting in the principal's office, calm but distant. The drawings, scattered on the desk, showed the sweetgum tree in intricate detail, with something dark and writhing contained within its branches. At the bottom of each picture, he'd written the same phrase over and over: "It remembers Grandma Ruby." As they walked to the car, Devon's small hand found Mrs. Chen's with surprising familiarity. "You were there when Grandma Ruby did the ceremony," he said matter-of-factly. Mrs. Chen squeezed his hand gently. "I was, child. And if the time comes, I'll be there when you do yours too." That evening, as Kendra tucked Devon into bed, the silver locket warm against her chest, she realized their quiet life on Elm Street was over. Whatever came next would require courage she wasn't sure she possessed, and knowledge she was only beginning to understand. But as she looked down at her son's peaceful face, she made a silent promise to her grandmother's memory and to the generations of women who had carried this responsibility before her. She would learn what she needed to learn. She would become what Devon needed her to become, and if the entity in the tree thought it could use her child to escape its ancient prison, it was about to discover just how fierce a mother's protection could be. The protection pouch from her grandmother's box had been sitting on Kendra's kitchen counter for 3 days, and each morning it seemed to have moved slightly from where she'd left it the night before. On Wednesday, she woke to find it beside Devon's breakfast plate, the cloth somehow radiating warmth like a heating pad. Devon didn't seem surprised to see it there. He picked it up carefully, his small fingers tracing the worn fabric with the reverence of someone handling something precious and fragile. "It wants to protect me," he said simply, tucking the pouch into his backpack alongside his school books. Kendra wanted to object, to maintain some semblance of normal parental control over their increasingly surreal situation. But the silver locket around her neck had been pulsing with gentle warmth since she'd first put it on, and she was beginning to understand that fighting against these family artifacts might be more dangerous than accepting their presence. That night, she woke to the sound of Devon's bedroom door creaking open. Through her partially opened door, she watched him move through the house with the careful deliberation of a sleepwalker. But his eyes were open and alert. He paused at the front door, his hand on the deadbolt, and she realized he was preparing to leave. "Devon, honey, where are you going?" He turned toward her voice but didn't seem to see her. "It's calling me, Mama. I need to go to the tree." Kendra's heart hammered as she approached him slowly, the way she might approach a spooked animal. "What's calling you?" "The guardian. She's been alone for so long." His voice held that same dreamy quality it had taken on at the park. But now there was sadness in it too, a empathy that seemed far too mature for an 8-year-old. "The guardian?" "The lady in the tree." Grandma Ruby knew her. She's not the bad thing, Mama. She's trying to keep the bad thing contained, but she's getting tired. Kendra's mind raced as she processed this information. The entity in the cocoon wasn't malevolent. It was protective. Had she misunderstood everything her grandmother's letter had tried to tell her? She guided Devon back to his room and sat with him until his breathing returned to the steady rhythm of natural sleep. But she didn't return to her own bed. Instead, she went to the kitchen and spread her grandmother's papers across the table, determined to read them more carefully. The second letter, which she'd only glanced at before, painted a more complex picture than she'd initially understood. The entity bound to the tree wasn't an invader or parasite. It was the spirit of the first root worker to die protecting the sacred space, transformed by the power of the old tree into something between human and elemental. She chose to bind herself to the tree rather than pass on, her grandmother had written, becoming a guardian that would never age. Never leave, never forget the responsibility. But the ritual that created her also created something else, a shadow, a hunger that feeds on spiritual energy and grows stronger with each generation. The true danger, Kendra realized with growing dread, wasn't the guardian spirit Devon had been hearing. It was whatever the guardian had been holding back for over a century. The next morning brought more troubling signs. Devon's teachers reported that he'd been staring out windows during lessons, claiming he could see people in the schoolyard who weren't there. At home, he began speaking to empty corners of rooms, carrying on conversations with invisible presences that seemed as real to him as anyone flesh. And blood, Kendra found herself jumping at shadows, the silver locket growing warm at unexpected moments throughout the day. Objects in the house had begun moving on their own. Nothing dramatic, just small displacements that she might have dismissed if they weren't happening so consistently. A book left on the coffee table would migrate to the mantelpiece overnight. The salt shaker would appear in different kitchen cabinets, despite her certainty about where she'd left it. By Friday evening, she'd reached her breaking point. She called Mrs. Chen and asked if she could come over after Devon went to bed. "The binding is failing," Mrs. Chen confirmed after hearing about the week's events. "Your son's awakening abilities are like a beacon, drawing both the guardian and the shadow toward him. The guardian is trying to prepare him for what's coming, but the shadow is using his power to weaken its prison. How do we stop it?" Mrs. Chen was quiet for a long moment, her weathered hands folded in her lap. "Child, I need to tell you something about the night your grandmother performed the binding ceremony. I wasn't just a witness, I was her anchor." Kendra felt the locket grow warm against her chest. "What does that mean?" "The guardian can't renew the binding alone. She needs a living person with the gift to channel the energy, to bridge the gap between the spirit world and our physical realm. Your grandmother provided that bridge in 1963, and I held her tethered to the living world to make sure she didn't get lost in the spiritual plane." The implications hit Kendra like ice water. "You're saying Devon will have to perform this ceremony?" "Not Devon alone. He's too young, too inexperienced. But with your support, with your shared family connection to the guardian, it might be possible." That weekend, Mrs. Chen began teaching them both about their heritage in earnest. She showed them how to recognize different types of spiritual energy, how to protect themselves when opening to supernatural influences, how to distinguish between helpful and harmful entities. Devon absorbed the lessons with the eager attention of a child learning a new language, one that finally made sense of experiences he'd been having his entire life. He could see the guardian now even during daylight hours, a tall woman in clothes from another era, her hands and feet rooted to the earth around the sweetgum tree. "She says her name is Celia," he told them during one of their practice sessions in the backyard. "She was only 16 when she made the choice to stay. She's been protecting everyone for so long that she's forgotten what it feels like to be fully human." Kendra watched her son communicate with a century-old spirit as casually as he might chat with a school friend, and struggled to reconcile this supernatural reality with her desire to give him a normal childhood. But normal was no longer an option. The shadow entity had begun manifesting more aggressively, drawn by Devon's increasing openness to the spirit world. Windows rattled without wind, temperatures dropped suddenly in specific rooms, and the house's electrical systems began behaving erratically. The breaking point came on Sunday night. Kendra woke to find every light in the house blazing, and Devon standing in the living room, his arms outstretched as if embracing someone only he could see. The air around him shimmered with visible energy, and she could swear she heard two voices, Devon's familiar tone and something else, something older and sadder. "Mama, Celia says it's almost time," Devon said without turning around. "The shadow is getting stronger because I'm learning to use my gift. She can't hold it much longer without help." Mrs. Chen arrived within minutes of Kendra's frantic phone call, taking in the scene with the calm of someone who had witnessed such things before. "How long do we have?" Kendra asked. The older woman consulted a small notebook filled with her own observations and calculations. "Days, maybe a week. The new moon is coming, which will make the binding ceremony more powerful. But it also means the shadow will make its strongest attempt to break free before then." That night, as Kendra sat beside Devon's bed, watching him sleep peacefully for the first time in days, she made the decision that would define the rest of their lives. She would embrace her grandmother's legacy fully, whatever the cost. She would learn what needed to be learned and become what needed to be become, because the alternative, losing Devon to forces she didn't understand, or worse, allowing something dangerous to escape into the world, was unthinkable. The quiet life she'd built on Elm Street was ending, but something stronger was taking its place. The knowledge that she came from a line of women who had never backed down from their responsibilities, and the determination to prove herself worthy of that legacy. Marcus Thompson had been the head librarian at the Magnolia County Historical Society for 15 years. And in all that time, he'd never had someone request access to the restricted archives with such urgency in their voice. When Kendra called Tuesday morning asking about historical documents related to Magnolia Park, something in her tone suggested this wasn't academic curiosity. "The land records go back to the 1840s, he said, leading her through the climate-controlled basement where the county's oldest documents were preserved. "But I should warn you, the history of that particular area is complicated." Kendra's hand went instinctively to the silver locket beneath her shirt. It had been pulsing with gentle warmth since she'd entered the building, as if responding to the proximity of historical documents that might hold answers to questions she was only beginning to understand. Marcus spread a large map across the research table, its edges yellowed with age and careful handling. "This is from 1889, the earliest detailed survey we have of the area that's now Magnolia Park. See here?" He pointed to a section marked with symbols that made Kendra's breath catch. This area was designated as a sacred grove, even in the official county records. The symbols on the map matched those carved into her grandmother's wooden box, and the silver locket grew noticeably warmer as she leaned in to examine them more closely. "Sacred to whom?" she asked. Marcus pulled out a folder thick with photographs and documents. "That's where it gets interesting." The land was part of the Fairfield plantation until 1863, when the enslaved people were officially freed. But according to these records, they'd been using this particular grove for religious gatherings for decades before emancipation. He showed her photographs from the early 1900s, formal portraits of African-American families, many of which included women wearing the same style of silver locket that now hung around Kendra's neck. The families who settled in this area after the Civil War maintained strong connections to what they called the old ways. They established what was essentially a healing community, with the grove as their spiritual center. Kendra studied the faces in the photographs, searching for family resemblances. In a group photo dated 1912, she found what she was looking for, a young woman who could have been her great-great-grandmother's twin, standing with her hand pressed against the bark of a massive sweetgum tree. "Do you have any records of what they actually did in the grove?" she asked. Marcus hesitated, then pulled out a leather-bound journal from the bottom of the folder. This was donated by a family in the 1970s. It's written in a mixture of English and what appears to be a form of spiritual notation that scholars still haven't fully decoded. As soon as Kendra touched the journal, the silver locket became almost hot against her skin. She opened it carefully, and the pages seemed to respond to her presence. Text that had appeared faded became darker, clearer, as if the book itself recognized her as someone authorized to read its contents. "The root workers," she whispered, reading passages that described rituals for healing, protection, and what the journal called binding dangerous spirits to prevent harm to the community. "You can read it?" Marcus asked with surprise. "Several linguistics professors have tried to translate those passages without success." Kendra realized she could not only read the text, but understand the spiritual concepts it described. The knowledge seemed to flow into her consciousness as naturally as breathing, as if it had always been there, waiting for her to need it. The journal detailed the grove's transformation from a place of healing to a spiritual battleground. It spoke of an entity that had begun feeding on the power generated by the community's rituals, growing stronger and more dangerous with each ceremony performed. The shadow hunger came with the pain of the land. One entry read in Kendra's grandmother's careful translation, written in the margins. "Born from blood and suffering, it seeks to devour what gives life." Young Zelia volunteered to bind herself to the sacred tree, becoming guardian eternal. But the cost was high. She could never leave, never fully die, never fully live. Marcus watched with growing fascination as Kendra translated passages that had stumped academic researchers. "Your family has some connection to these root workers?" "More than I realized," Kendra said, photographing pages with her phone. "My grandmother never told me we were descended from the original guardians of this place." The journal's final entries, dated 1889, described the binding ceremony in detail. Celia, just 16 years old, had volunteered to merge her spirit with the ancient sweetgum tree, creating a permanent guardian that could hold back the shadow entity indefinitely. But the ritual required renewal each generation, performed by someone of her bloodline, with the spiritual sensitivity to bridge the worlds of living and dead. "According to this," Kendra said, "the ceremony has to be renewed every 25 to 30 years, depending on how much spiritual activity occurs in the area." Marcus did quick mental calculation. "Your grandmother would have been the right age in the early 1960s. 1963, Kendra confirmed, remembering the photograph she'd found. "And now it's Devon's turn." That afternoon, Kendra brought Devon and Mrs. Chen to the Historical Society. She wanted Devon to see the photographs, to understand that he was part of a proud tradition, rather than facing something terrible and alien. Devon studied the pictures with intense concentration, his small finger tracing the faces of children from over a century ago. "They look like us," he said with wonder. "They are us, baby. They're our family." Mrs. Chen had been unusually quiet throughout the archive visit, but as they prepared to leave, she pulled Marcus aside. "There's something else you need to show them," she said quietly. "The newspaper reports from 1963. Marcus hesitated. "Are you sure? They're disturbing. They need to understand what happens if the binding fails." "The newspaper clippings from late 1962 and early 1963 painted a picture of a community in crisis. There had been a series of unexplained incidents, sudden illnesses, children speaking in voices not their own, livestock dying without apparent cause. The local paper had attributed it to mass hysteria and superstitious thinking, but the pattern was clear to anyone who understood what they were looking at. The shadow entity was breaking free. Mrs. Chen explained. "Your grandmother was barely 18, terrified out of her mind. But she performed the binding ceremony because the alternative was losing everyone she loved." Devon had grown very quiet, his small body pressed close to Kendra's side. "Celia says the shadow is stronger now than it was then. It's been feeding on all the spiritual energy in the area for 60 years, which means," Mrs. Chen said grimly, "the next binding ceremony will be the most difficult one ever attempted." As they drove home that evening, Kendra felt the weight of 5 generations of responsibility settling on her shoulders. Her son would have to face something that had challenged grown women, and she would have to be strong enough to anchor him to the world of the living, when everything in him might be called toward the spiritual realm. But she also felt something she hadn't expected: pride. Devon wasn't just dealing with a burden. He was inheriting a legacy of protectors, healers, and guardians who had kept their community safe for over a century. "Mama," Devon said from the back seat, "Celia wants to know if you're ready to meet her properly." Kendra looked in the rearview mirror at her son's serious expression. "What does that mean?" "She says tomorrow night, when the moon is dark, she can show herself to you the way she shows herself to me. But you have to be wearing the locket and carrying the protection pouch." The silver around her neck pulsed with warmth, as if confirming the guardian's message. Kendra realized that their time for preparation was running out. Tomorrow night she would finally meet the 16-year-old girl who had sacrificed her human life to protect future generations, including the woman and child now driving home through streets that existed because of her continued vigilance. "Tell Celia I'm ready," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Tell her it's time I learned what being part of this family really means." The moon was a thin crescent, barely visible through the canopy of leaves, as Kendra and Devon made their way through Magnolia Park after midnight. Mrs. Chen had insisted on coming with them, her presence both comforting and nerve-wracking. If someone with her experience was worried about this encounter, maybe Kendra should be more frightened than she was. But the silver locket around her neck radiated warmth rather than the cold she might have expected from something supernatural. And Devon walked beside her with the confident step of a child visiting a beloved friend. In his pocket, the protection pouch seemed to pulse in rhythm with her locket, creating a gentle harmony of spiritual energy. As they approached the ancient sweetgum tree, the air itself seemed to thicken with anticipation. Kendra could feel something watching them, assessing them, but not with malevolent intent, more like a careful host ensuring her guests were who they claimed to be. "Celia," Devon called softly. "We're here." The response was immediate and overwhelming. The temperature around the tree dropped 20 degrees in seconds, but instead of the harsh cold Kendra might have expected, it felt like stepping into perfectly conditioned air on a sweltering summer day. The Spanish moss hanging from the branches began to glow with soft bioluminescence, creating a cathedral of gentle light. And then she appeared. Celia looked exactly as Devon had described, a young woman of perhaps 16, though her eyes held the depth of someone who had witnessed more than a century of change. Her dress was simple but well made, the kind worn by respectable young women in the 1880s, but it seemed to be woven from moonlight and shadow rather than ordinary fabric. Her feet didn't quite touch the ground, but root-like extensions connected her to the base of the great tree, making it clear that she was no longer entirely human. Kendra Washington. Celia's voice seemed to come from everywhere at once. The rustling leaves, the creaking branches, the very air they breathed. "You carry your great-great-grandmother's eyes and your grandmother's stubborn heart. You knew them both. Child, I've known every woman in your line since I chose to bind myself to this tree. I watched your great-great-grandmother perform the first renewal ceremony in 1889. I guided your grandmother through hers in 1963. And now I must ask you to help your son become something I never wanted any child to have to become." Mrs. Chen stepped forward, and Kendra realized the older woman could see Celia as clearly as they could. "The binding papers we found, they're more than just instructions, aren't they?" Celia's expression grew grave. "They're a contract, a promise made between my spirit and the shadow entity that feeds on spiritual energy. I agreed to serve as its prison for as long as my bloodline continued to renew the binding. But the shadow has been growing stronger with each passing year, feeding not just on the rituals performed in this space, but on all the spiritual activity in the surrounding area." She gestured to the space around them, and suddenly Kendra could see what Celia saw. streams of energy flowing through the park like rivers of light, connecting every living thing in a vast, pulsing network. The modern world has more spiritual seekers than ever before, Celia continued. Yoga classes, meditation groups, crystal healing circles, all of it happening within 5 miles of this tree, all of it feeding the shadow's hunger. It's grown beyond what I can contain alone. Devon stepped closer to the base of the tree, his small hand finding one of the root extensions that anchored Celia to the physical world. That's why you need me to help, isn't it? Not to replace you, but to share the burden. You understand so quickly, little guardian. Yes, the binding must evolve. Instead of one spirit holding back the shadow, there must be 2. Myself, experienced but fading, and you, young but incredibly powerful. Kendra felt her heart clench with protective fear. What does that mean for Devon? Will he have to stay bound to this tree like you have? Celia's smile was sad but reassuring. Not like me, no. I chose to give up my human life entirely, to become something between spirit and elemental force. But the ritual can be performed differently now. Devon can serve as a living anchor while maintaining his human existence. He would need to visit this place regularly to renew the binding through ceremony rather than permanent sacrifice. How regularly? Mrs. Chen asked, her tone suggesting she already suspected the answer. Every full moon for the rest of his natural life. The weight of that responsibility settled over them all. Devon would never have a normal life, never be able to move away from this place, never be free from the obligation to serve as guardian against a force most people couldn't even perceive. But Devon's response surprised them all. That's okay, he said simply. I like it here, and Celia's been alone for so long she shouldn't have to keep doing this by herself. Celia knelt, or the closest thing to kneeling that someone rooted to a tree could manage, bringing herself to Devon's eye level. You don't have to decide tonight, child. This is not a burden that should be accepted lightly, but I do have to decide soon, don't I? Because the shadow is getting stronger around them. The peaceful glow of the Spanish moss flickered ominously, and for just a moment, Kendra caught sight of something else, a writhing darkness that seemed to press against invisible barriers. Testing for weakness. 3 days, Celia confirmed. The new moon in 3 days will provide the spiritual energy needed for either the binding renewal or... She didn't finish the sentence, but they all understood. If they couldn't perform the ceremony, the shadow would likely break free entirely. Mrs. Chen pulled out a small notebook and began writing quickly. What will you need for the ceremony? Celia's form became more solid, more present, as if the discussion of practical matters helped anchor her to their reality. 7 stones from the riverbed, blessed in running water under starlight. Herbs from the old-growth forest, not the domesticated plants, but their wild ancestors. Fire carried from a hearth that has burned for 3 generations. And blood freely given from the guardian's line. Kendra's protective instincts flared. Blood from Devon? Just a few drops. Mixed with earth from this sacred ground. The shadow can only be bound by willing sacrifice. It feeds on unwilling victims. But willing guardians have power over it. They spent the next hour learning the details of the ceremony, with Celia patiently explaining each component and its spiritual significance. Devon absorbed every word with the intense focus of a child, learning something that would define the rest of his life. As dawn approached and Celia began to fade with the growing light, she offered one final piece of guidance. The shadow will not go quietly into renewed binding. It will try to break free during the ceremony itself, using fear and doubt as weapons against you. But remember, your family has faced this challenge successfully for generations. You carry their strength in your blood, their wisdom in your hearts. The walk home through the early morning streets felt like returning from another world. Devon chatted quietly with Mrs. Chen about the herbs they would need to gather, while Kendra wrestled with the magnitude of what they were preparing to attempt. By the time they reached Elm Street, she had made her decision. Her son would never have the normal childhood she'd planned for him, but he would have something perhaps more valuable, the knowledge that he was part of a legacy of protectors, that his life had meaning and purpose beyond what most people could imagine. And if performing this ceremony meant he would spend his life bound to Magnolia Park and its guardian spirit, then she would make sure he understood the honor inherent in that responsibility. The shadow entity had been contained for over a century by the sacrifice of a 16-year-old girl. Now it was Devon's turn to step into that legacy, and Kendra's turn to prove herself worthy of the trust placed in her family for generations. 3 days to gather what they needed. 3 days to prepare for a ceremony that would either secure another generation of protection for their community or unleash something that had been growing in power and hunger for 60 years. She looked at her son, walking beside her with the calm confidence of someone who had found his purpose in life, and realized that she had never been more proud or more terrified in her entire life. The envelope had been hidden behind her grandmother's bedroom mirror for decades, yellowed with age and sealed with wax that bore the same symbols carved into the family's protective artifacts. Kendra found it while searching for the ceremonial items Celia had described, and something about the way the silver locket grew cold against her skin when she touched it made her hesitate to open it immediately. Mrs. Chen was in the garden with Devon, helping him identify the specific herbs they would need for the binding ceremony, their voices carrying through the open window as they discussed the spiritual properties of different plants. It seemed like the perfect time to examine whatever secret her grandmother had felt important enough to hide. The wax seal broke easily, as if it had been waiting for exactly this moment. Inside was a letter in her grandmother's handwriting, but also something else. A smaller envelope, addressed in script she didn't recognize. As she read the first few lines of her grandmother's letter, the comfortable understanding she'd built about her family's history began to crumble. "My dearest granddaughter," it began, "if you are reading this, then Devon's abilities have manifested, and the time has come to tell you the truth about your mother." Kendra's hands began to tremble as she continued reading. Her mother, Kendra Washington, hadn't simply chosen to reject the family's spiritual heritage, as Mrs. Chen and her grandmother had always claimed. She had actively worked to sever the bloodline's connection to the guardian spirit, believing that she could free future generations from what she saw as an unfair burden. Sandra was the most gifted of any woman in our line, the letter revealed. Her connection to Celia was so strong that she could communicate with the guardian spirit from the age of 3. But instead of seeing this as a blessing, she came to view it as a curse that would trap her children and grandchildren in a life they didn't choose. The letter went on to describe how Sandra had sought out practitioners of different spiritual traditions, looking for a way to permanently break the binding that connected their family to the sacred tree. She had believed that if she could free Celia from her eternal guardianship, the shadow entity would simply dissipate without its spiritual prison. I tried to explain to her that the shadow doesn't need our binding to exist. It needs our binding to stay contained. But she was young and idealistic, and she couldn't accept that some responsibilities are inherited rather than chosen. Kendra's heart hammered as she read about the ritual her mother had attempted when she was barely 20 years old. Using knowledge gathered from various spiritual traditions, Sandra had tried to perform what she called a liberation ceremony, designed to free Celia from her connection to the tree and dissolve the shadow entity entirely. Instead, she had nearly destroyed everything their family had worked to protect. The ceremony went wrong in ways I still don't fully understand, Grandma Ruby had written. Instead of freeing Celia, it severed Sandra's own connection to the guardian spirit so completely that she lost access to all her spiritual abilities. But worse, the energy from her severed connection didn't dissipate. It was absorbed by the shadow entity, making it stronger than it had ever been before. The smaller envelope contained a letter from Sandra herself, written shortly before she left town forever. It was addressed to the daughter she would never meet, filled with justifications for choices she had made and warnings about the family legacy. By the time you read this, Sandra had written, I will be long gone from this place and its influence. I have tried to free our family from a burden that should never have been ours to carry, but I have failed. Worse, I may have made things more dangerous for future generations. Kendra felt sick as she read her mother's account of the failed liberation ceremony. The spiritual energy that had been building in the Washington bloodline for generations, energy that should have been passed down through normal inheritance, had instead been concentrated and fed directly to the shadow entity. When Sandra severed her connection, I pray that my actions will mean my daughter never manifests the gift. The letter continued. But if she does, if the spiritual abilities skip my generation and appear in hers or her children's generation, they will be more powerful than anything our family has ever experienced. The concentrated energy will have to go somewhere, and it will likely be overwhelming. Mrs. Chen's voice calling from the garden interrupted Kendra's reading, but she couldn't bring herself to respond. The truth about Devon's extraordinary abilities wasn't that he was naturally gifted. It was that he had inherited the accumulated spiritual power of a severed generation, making him potentially the most powerful guardian their family had ever produced. But it also meant he was in more danger than any of them had realized. Kendra? Is everything all right in there? She forced herself to respond, though her voice sounded foreign to her own ears. I'll be right out. But first she had to finish reading. The final page of her grandmother's letter contained the most devastating revelation of all. The shadow entity has been feeding on Sandra's severed energy for almost 30 years now. It's not just stronger than it was in 1963, it's fundamentally different. Celia believes it may have evolved beyond what the traditional binding ceremony can contain. Devon's power might be the only thing capable of renewing the binding, but it might also be exactly what the shadow needs to finally break free entirely. Kendra's hands were shaking so hard she could barely hold the pages. Her mother's well-intentioned attempt to free future generations had instead created the most dangerous situation their family had ever faced. Devon wasn't just inheriting the responsibility of guardian, he was inheriting a crisis that could destroy everything their ancestors had died to protect. Mama? Devon's voice came from the doorway, concern evident in his tone. The locket is glowing. She looked down and realized the silver around her neck was indeed glowing with a cold blue light she'd never seen before. More alarming, Devon's eyes reflected the same ethereal glow. Something's wrong, he said, moving to her side with the fluid grace that had become more pronounced as his abilities developed. Celia is trying to warn us about something. Mrs. Chen appeared behind him, took one look at Kendra's face and the letters scattered across the bed, and immediately understood. You found Ruby's confession. You knew? Kendra's voice was barely a whisper. I suspected. Your grandmother never told me the details, but I knew Sandra had tried something foolish before she left town. The energy patterns around the tree changed after that, became more volatile, more dangerous. Devon moved closer to the letters, and as he did, the text began to glow with the same blue light as the locket. Mama, what does this mean for the ceremony? Mrs. Chen answered before Kendra could find her voice. It means we have to be more careful than we thought. The shadow entity isn't just hungry, it's specifically hungry for the energy your mother fed it 30 years ago. Devon's power might be the key to binding it, but it might also be exactly what it needs to escape. So what do we do? Kendra looked at her son, this brave, gifted child who had inherited both a sacred responsibility and a dangerous legacy he hadn't chosen, and felt her resolve crystallize. We do what our family has always done, she said, gathering the letters and tucking them carefully into her grandmother's journal. We face what needs to be faced, and we protect the people we love. But privately, she wondered if they were walking toward a ceremony that would save their community, or accidentally unleash the very thing their family had died to contain. Her mother's betrayal had changed the rules of engagement, and none of them could be certain what would happen when Devon's concentrated power met the shadow entity that had been feeding on stolen Washington family energy for 3 decades. 3 days until the new moon. 3 days to figure out how to perform a binding ceremony that had never been attempted under these circumstances. With stakes higher than any guardian before them had ever faced, outside, storm clouds were gathering despite the weather forecast's promise of clear skies. And Kendra couldn't help but wonder if the shadow entity was already beginning to test the boundaries of its prison. The 7 river stones lay in a perfect circle on Kendra's kitchen table, each one smooth and dark from decades of running water. Mrs. Chen had spent the better part of 2 days finding stones that met Celia's specific requirements, perfectly round, touched by moonlight for at least 50 years, and small enough for Devon's hands to manage during the ceremony. "These will anchor the binding circle," she explained, as Devon carefully examined each stone, his fingertips tracing their surfaces with the reverence of someone handling sacred objects. "When placed around the tree in the proper pattern, they'll create a spiritual barrier that the shadow entity cannot cross." But the stones were only one component of what had become the most complex preparation any of them had ever undertaken. The herbs Celia required could only be found in the old-growth forest beyond Magnolia Park, in areas where civilization had never left its mark. Devon and Mrs. Chen had spent yesterday morning foraging, guided by the boys' increasingly reliable spiritual intuition. "The shadow knows we're preparing something," Devon had reported after their return from the forest. "Celia says it's been testing the boundaries of its prison more aggressively. Sometimes I can feel it pressing against my mind, trying to understand what we're planning." That had been the most frightening development yet. If the shadow entity could access Devon's thoughts even partially, their entire plan might be compromised before they could execute it. Kendra had barely slept for 3 nights. Instead, spending the dark hours poring over her grandmother's journals and the historical documents Marcus had copied for them. She was looking for any precedent, any guidance for performing a binding ceremony under circumstances no guardian before them had faced. The more she learned, the more convinced she became that they were attempting something unprecedented. Previous binding ceremonies had been performed by guardians who inherited their role in an unbroken line of spiritual connection. Devon's power came from a severed bloodline, concentrated and potentially unpredictable, in ways that even Celia couldn't fully anticipate. "Mama, you need to eat something," Devon said, appearing at her side with a sandwich and a cup of the calming tea. She'd been too nervous to remember, to make for herself. She looked at her 8-year-old son. This child who was caring for her emotional needs while preparing to face supernatural forces that had challenged grown women, and felt a surge of pride so intense it nearly brought her to tears. "How are you so calm about all this?" she asked. Devon considered the question seriously, the way he approached everything these days. "I think it's because I finally understand why I'm different. All my life, I felt like I was waiting for something, like there was some important thing I was supposed to do, but I didn't know what it was. Now I know." The afternoon brought an unexpected challenge. Principal Harrison called to report that Devon had been acting strangely at school again, not disruptively, but with the kind of focused intensity that made his teachers nervous. More concerning, several other children had complained about nightmares featuring the dark thing in the trees that seemed to know details about Magnolia Park they couldn't possibly have learned. Through normal means, the shadow is reaching out beyond its usual boundaries, Mrs. Chen said grimly when Kendra shared the news. "It's trying to create fear and chaos before the ceremony, hoping to disrupt our concentration." That evening, as they performed their final practice run of the binding ritual in Kendra's backyard, the spiritual pressure became almost overwhelming. The silver locket grew so hot against Kendra's skin that she had to hold it away from her body, while Devon's eyes took on the ethereal glow that indicated his connection to the guardian spirit was fully active. "Celia says the shadow has been calling to her all day," Devon reported during a break in their practice. Not trying to escape, but trying to negotiate. It wants to make some kind of deal. What kind of deal? It says if we let it go free, it'll leave our family alone forever. It'll find somewhere else to feed, somewhere far away from here. Kendra and Mrs. Chen exchanged glances. They both knew such promises from malevolent entities were worthless. But the fact that the shadow was attempting negotiation suggested it was genuinely concerned about the upcoming ceremony. What did Celia tell it? She said our family doesn't make deals with things that feed on human suffering. She said, we'll renew the binding as our ancestors have done, or we'll die trying. The simple certainty in Devon's voice reminded Kendra of her grandmother's stubborn determination, and she realized that whatever happened tomorrow night, her son had already become the guardian he was meant to be. The final day passed in a blur of last-minute preparations. Marcus Thompson arrived in the afternoon with photocopies of additional historical documents he'd discovered, including detailed sketches of the binding circle, a configuration from the 1889 ceremony. Mrs. Chen used these to create a precise map of where each stone needed to be placed around the sweetgum tree. The positioning has to be exact, she warned them. Even a few inches off could create gaps in the spiritual barrier that the shadow might exploit. As sunset approached, bringing them closer to the midnight ceremony, Kendra found herself making what felt like final preparations. She called her clinic to cancel the next day's appointments, though she didn't know if she'd be in any condition to work after attempting something that had challenged every woman in her family line. She also wrote a letter to Devon, to be opened only if something went wrong during the ceremony. In it, she tried to explain how proud she was of his courage, how much she loved him, and how important it was for him to continue their family's legacy, even if she wasn't there to guide him. But as she sealed the letter and tucked it into her desk drawer, Kendra realized she had no intention of letting anything happen to either of them. Her mother had tried to break the cycle of guardianship and had instead made it more dangerous. Her grandmother had carried the burden alone for decades. Now it was Kendra's turn to prove that the Washington women were stronger when they worked together than when they tried to face their responsibilities in isolation. "Are you ready for this?" Mrs. Chen asked as they prepared to leave for Magnolia Park. Kendra looked at Devon, who was carefully packing the 7 river stones into a canvas bag with the solemnity of someone preparing for battle. His small hands were steady, his expression calm but determined. "We're as ready as we can be," she said. The walk to Magnolia Park felt different than any they'd taken before. The familiar streets seemed charged with anticipation, and every shadow looked like it might conceal something watching them. Other families were settled in for normal Sunday evenings, completely unaware that the next few hours would determine whether their community remained protected or became prey for something that had been growing in hunger and power for over a century. As they approached the ancient sweetgum tree, Kendra felt the weight of 5 generations of responsibility settling on her shoulders. Her great-great-grandmother had helped establish the original binding. Her grandmother had renewed it successfully in 1963. Her mother had tried to break it and had instead made it more dangerous. Now it was her turn, and Devon's, to prove that some family legacies were worth preserving no matter the cost. The moon was completely dark overhead, creating perfect conditions for spiritual work. Around the base of the great tree, the 7 stones seemed to pulse with their own inner light as Devon arranged them according to Mrs. Chen's careful instructions. "Celia's here," Devon announced quietly. "She says it's time to begin." The sacred drum that Mrs. Chen produced from a canvas bag was unlike anything Kendra had ever seen. Carved from what appeared to be a section of sweetgum bark, its surface was covered with the same spirals and crescents that decorated her grandmother's protective artifacts. But as Devon's hands found the drumsticks, also carved from sweetgum wood, the instrument seemed to come alive with its own energy. "Your great-great-grandmother made this," Mrs. Chen explained, as Devon began to play a rhythm that seemed to flow from instinct rather than instruction. It was carved from a branch that fell from this very tree during a storm in 1887. Celia guided her in its creation, knowing that future ceremonies would require a way to communicate across the spiritual planes. The drumbeat echoed through Magnolia Park with supernatural resonance, each strike seeming to travel not just through the air, but through the earth itself, awakening energies that had been dormant since the last binding ceremony 60 years ago. Kendra felt the rhythm in her bones, in her heartbeat, in the pulsing of the silver locket against her chest. Around them, the 7 river stones began to glow with soft light, marking the corners of a spiritual boundary that was invisible to normal sight, but blazed like beacon fires to anyone with the gift. As Devon continued drumming, the boundary grew stronger, more defined, until Kendra could actually see the barrier of energy connecting each stone to its neighbors. "The circle is established," Mrs. Chen announced, her voice carrying despite the fact that she was speaking barely above a whisper. "Celia, we call upon you to join us in this sacred space." The response was immediate and overwhelming. The temperature around the sweetgum tree dropped dramatically, but instead of uncomfortable cold, it felt like stepping into perfectly conditioned air. The Spanish moss began to glow with the same bioluminescence they'd witnessed during their first meeting with the guardian spirit, but brighter now, more focused, and then Celia herself materialized, more solid and present than Kendra had ever seen her. The guardian spirit looked exactly as she had in life, a young woman of 16 with intelligent eyes and the kind of quiet determination that suggested she had always been older than her years. But her connection to the tree was more visible now, root-like extensions flowing from her feet and hands directly into the ancient trunk. "My sisters," Celia said, her voice carrying the weight of over a century of solitary guardianship. "I have waited so long to share this burden." Devon's drumming shifted to a more complex rhythm, and Kendra realized he was responding to spiritual cues she couldn't perceive. The barrier around their circle grew stronger, more impenetrable, but she could also sense something pressing against it from the outside, something dark and hungry that had been awakened by their ceremony. "The shadow knows what we're doing," Celia warned. "It's gathering strength for one final attempt to break free while the spiritual energies are heightened." Mrs. Chen began the formal invocation, words in a mixture of English and what sounded like the spiritual notation from her grandmother's journals. As she spoke, Kendra felt her understanding of the ceremony deepen, as if knowledge that had been dormant in her blood was finally awakening. "We call upon the ancestors who established this binding," Mrs. Chen intoned. "We call upon the wisdom of the root workers who gave their lives to protect this community. We call upon the strength of the Washington bloodline to renew the sacred trust." The air inside their circle began to shimmer with visible energy, patterns, streams of light that connected each participant to the others, and all of them to the guardian spirit bound to the ancient tree. Kendra could see the spiritual threads that linked her to her grandmother, to her great-great-grandmother, to every woman in their line who had carried this responsibility. But she could also see the severed connection where her mother's rejection had broken the chain, and the way that break had created a reservoir of concentrated power that now blazed around Devon like spiritual armor. "Now comes the dangerous part," Celia said, her form flickering as something pressed harder against the barrier surrounding them. "The shadow will try to break through our defenses and claim Devon's power for itself. You must anchor him to this world while I guide him into the spiritual realm where the true binding takes place." Devon's drumming had become hypnotic, his small body swaying with the rhythm as his connection to the ceremony deepened. But his eyes were still clear, still focused, still completely present in the moment. "I'm ready," he said, his young voice steady despite the magnitude of what they were attempting. Kendra moved to stand directly behind her son, her hands resting on his shoulders, the silver locket now blazing with heat against her chest. Through the physical contact, she could feel Devon's spiritual energy, vast, concentrated, powerful, beyond anything their family line had ever produced. but she could also feel something else pressing against the edges of their ceremony. The shadow entity was no longer content to wait and watch. It was actively testing their defenses, looking for any weakness it could exploit. The drumbeat faltered for just a moment as something invisible struck the spiritual barrier around them. Devon recovered quickly, but not before Kendra felt a chill of pure malevolence brush against her consciousness. "Hold the circle," Mrs. Chen commanded. "Whatever happens, maintain the boundary." Around the edge of their sacred space, darkness began to gather, not the natural shadows of night, but something actively hostile that seemed to absorb light rather than simply exist in its absence. The shadow entity was manifesting physically, taking shape from decades of accumulated hunger and rage, and as it pressed against their defenses with increasing desperation, Kendra realized that the real battle was just beginning. The darkness that pressed against their protective circle was unlike anything Kendra could have imagined. It moved with liquid malevolence, testing each point where the river stones anchored their spiritual barrier, searching for the smallest weakness that might allow it entry. But worse than its alien hunger was its familiarity. She could sense traces of her mother's severed spiritual energy woven throughout its essence. Decades of stolen power that had made it something far more dangerous than the original shadow entity. Devon's drumming never faltered, even as sweat beaded on his forehead from the effort of maintaining the protective rhythm. But his eyes had taken on the ethereal glow that indicated his consciousness was operating partially in the spiritual realm, guided by Celia toward the plane of existence where the real binding ceremony had to take place. "I can see it now," he whispered, his young voice carrying harmonics that suggested he was speaking from two places at once. "The shadow isn't just hungry, it's angry. It feels betrayed because Mama Sandra promised it freedom and then couldn't deliver." Through her hands on Devon's shoulders, Kendra could feel the spiritual battle beginning. Her son's consciousness was descending into layers of reality she couldn't perceive directly, but she could sense his progress through the heat of the silver locket and the way the protective circle's energy shifted around them. Suddenly, a new presence joined their ceremony, one that made the air shimmer with warmth and recognition. "Grandchild, you are not alone in this." The voice was Grandma Ruby's, but younger, stronger than Kendra remembered. She looked up to see her grandmother's spirit standing at the edge of their circle, her form translucent but unmistakably real. But she wasn't alone. Behind her stood other figures, generations of Washington women who had carried the Guardian's responsibility. "The ancestors come to lend their strength," Celia explained, her own form becoming more solid as the spiritual plane intersected more directly with their physical ceremony. "This binding requires more power than any one guardian can provide alone." Mrs. Chen's revelation came at exactly the right moment. As the shadow entity pressed harder against their defenses and Devon's spirit descended deeper into the binding ceremony, she stepped forward with the calm confidence of someone who'd been preparing for this moment her entire life. "I need to tell you both something," she said, never taking her eyes off the roiling darkness that surrounded their circle. "I'm not just your neighbor who happened to be Ruby's friend. I'm your grandmother's younger sister." The shock of this revelation hit Kendra like a physical blow, but it also explained so much. Mrs. Chen's intimate knowledge of the family's spiritual practices, her ability to see Celia as clearly as they could, her presence at the original binding ceremony in 1963, Florence Washington Chen, Grandma Ruby's spirit said with a smile that transcended the danger of their situation. "My baby sister, who gave up her own name and heritage to marry into the Chinese community, but never gave up her connection to our family's calling." Mrs. Chen, Aunt Florence, began to glow with her own spiritual energy as she joined her power to the binding ceremony. "I've been watching over this family for 60 years, waiting for the moment when my strength might be needed. That moment is now." The combined power of the living and dead Washington women created a spiritual force, unlike anything the shadow entity had ever encountered. But instead of retreating, it responded with desperate fury, throwing itself against their protective barrier with increasing violence. Devon's consciousness had reached the deepest level of the spiritual realm, where Celia waited to guide him through the actual binding ritual. Through their physical connection, Kendra could feel her son's wonder and terror as he experienced the full magnitude of forces he was being asked to contain. "The shadow is trying to possess me," Devon reported, his voice now coming from someplace far from his physical body. "It says it recognizes Mama Sandra's energy in my spiritual signature, and it has a right to claim what was promised to it. Reject its claim," Celia's voice commanded with the authority of someone who had faced this same battle a century ago. "Your mother's promise was made without understanding and without authority. You carry the true guardian's gift, but the shadow entity wasn't finished with its manipulations." As Devon began the binding words that would renew its spiritual prison, it turned its attention to the weakest link in their ceremony, Kendra herself. Without warning, visions flooded her consciousness, memories that weren't her own, experiences her mother had lived through in the weeks leading up to her failed liberation ceremony. She saw Sandra as a young woman, terrified by the magnitude of the responsibility she was inheriting. Desperate to find another way to protect future generations, the shadow entity whispered through these borrowed memories, offering the same deal it had once proposed to her mother: freedom from the guardian's burden in exchange for allowing it to feed elsewhere, on communities that had no protection. For a moment, just one terrible moment, Kendra felt the temptation. Devon could have a normal childhood. They could move away from Magnolia Park, leave this spiritual battleground behind, let someone else's family carry the burden. But then she felt her son's trust flowing through their physical connection, and heard the voices of the ancestor spirits who had given everything to maintain this protection for over a century. The shadow entity's promises were lies designed to create the doubt that would weaken their ceremony. "I reject your false bargains," Kendra said aloud, her voice carrying across both the physical and spiritual planes. "Our family keeps its sacred trusts." The effect was immediate and dramatic. Devon's spiritual energy blazed brighter as her rejection of the shadow's temptations strengthened their connection. Around the edge of their circle, the darkness began to writhe and contract, no longer pressing outward against their barrier, but being drawn inexorably back toward the ancient sweetgum tree. "The binding is taking hold," Celia announced, her voice filled with relief and something that might have been joy. "The shadow will be contained for another generation." But the shadow entity had one final, desperate gambit. Instead of allowing itself to be bound back to the tree, it abandoned its long-held position and threw itself directly at Devon, attempting to merge with his concentrated spiritual energy and use his power to break free entirely. In that crucial moment, as malevolent force met Guardian's gift in direct spiritual combat, every ancestor spirit in their circle poured their strength into protecting the young Guardian who represented their family's future. And Devon, 8 years old but carrying the wisdom of generations, spoke the final binding words with absolute authority: "By blood and choice, by gift and sacrifice, by the will of the living and the strength of the dead, you are bound." The shadow entity's scream of rage and defeat echoed across both spiritual and physical planes as it was drawn inexorably back to its prison, but this time with additional layers of binding that would hold it more securely than ever before. As Devon's consciousness returned fully to the physical realm and his drumming gradually slowed to match the rhythm of their heartbeats, Kendra realized that they had accomplished something unprecedented. A binding ceremony performed not by a single guardian, but by an entire family, working across the boundaries of life and death. The circle of riverstones dimmed as the spiritual energies settled back into balance, and one by one the ancestor spirits began to fade, but not before each offered words of pride and blessing for the newest generation of guardians. "You did well, granddaughter," Grandma Ruby's spirit said as she prepared to return to whatever realm she had come from. both of you. The family's protection is secure for another generation. As dawn approached and the last traces of supernatural energy settled around the ancient sweetgum tree, Kendra looked at her son, no longer just her child, but a true guardian who had faced down forces that would have challenged grown women, and realized that their quiet life on Elm Street had ended forever. But what was beginning in its place might be even better. A family legacy they could both be proud of, carried forward with full understanding of its importance and cost. 6 months after the binding ceremony, Magnolia Park had become a different place entirely, not in any way that casual visitors would notice, but in the subtle energies that made it feel more welcoming, more peaceful, more alive, with positive spiritual presence. Families lingered longer on weekend walks, children played with less aggression, and even the wildlife seemed more abundant and unafraid. Devon's journal, the blank book that had appeared on his bedside table the morning after the ceremony, was now half filled with careful observations about his experiences as the newest guardian in the Washington family line. He wrote in it every evening after completing his homework, documenting not just the spiritual phenomena he encountered, but his growing understanding of the responsibility he had inherited. The guardian's job isn't just about keeping bad things locked up, he had written in his most recent entry. It's about helping the good energy flow better, so people and animals and plants can all be healthier and happier. Kendra read these entries with a mixture of pride and amazement at her son's mature understanding of forces most adults couldn't even perceive. The shy, introspective child she had worried about for years had blossomed into a confident young guardian who approached his unusual gifts with both wisdom and wonder. The monthly visits to Celia had become the foundation of their new routine. Every full moon, Devon would sit beneath the sweetgum tree and spend an hour in communication with the guardian spirit, learning the subtleties of spiritual protection and receiving guidance on managing his rapidly developing abilities. Kendra and Aunt Florence, she still couldn't get used to thinking of Mrs. Chen by her real relationship, would maintain a protective circle around them, though the binding was now strong enough that such precautions were probably unnecessary. Celia says I'm learning faster than any guardian before me, Devon reported after one such session. She thinks it's because I started so young, but also because I have you and Aunt Florence to help me stay balanced. The discovery that Mrs. Chen was actually her grandmother's sister had transformed their relationship in wonderful ways. Aunt Florence moved freely between the house on Elm Street and her own home next door, sharing family stories that filled gaps in Kendra's understanding of their heritage and teaching Devon techniques for spiritual protection that had been passed down through generations. Your great-great-grandmother could communicate with plant spirits, she told Devon during one of their garden sessions. That's why our family's herbal remedies are so much more effective than what most people can achieve. The plants themselves guide us toward the right combinations. Kendra's herbal practice had expanded dramatically as word spread through the community about her family's traditional healing knowledge. The converted garage that had once housed a modest wellness clinic now served clients from 3 counties, all seeking the kind of spiritual and physical healing that modern medicine couldn't provide. But perhaps the most significant change was the way other families with spiritual gifts had begun seeking them out. It turned out that the Washington family's role as guardians had created a beacon that drew others with supernatural abilities to the area. Parents brought children who could see auras, elderly women who had prophetic dreams, teenagers struggling with telepathic abilities they didn't understand. We're becoming like a hub, Devon observed with the matter-of-fact acceptance that characterized his approach to all extraordinary circumstances. People come here when they need help understanding their gifts. The house on Elm Street had been expanded to accommodate what was essentially becoming a school for spiritual development. Kendra had hired contractors to convert the basement into meeting rooms, where families could gather to share experiences and learn from each other. Devon, despite his young age, had become one of the most effective teachers, his natural empathy and lack of self-consciousness making him particularly good at helping other children accept abilities that might otherwise frighten them. Marcus Thompson had become a regular visitor as well, his role evolving from county historian to documenter of the spiritual community that was forming around the Washington family's guardianship. He was working on what would eventually become a comprehensive history of supernatural families in the region, with the hope that future generations would have better resources than the scattered documents and oral traditions previous families had relied upon. "What you've accomplished here is remarkable," he told Kendra during one of his research visits. "You've taken something that was traditionally a burden carried in isolation and turned it into a source of community strength." The transformation wasn't without challenges. There had been skeptics in the community who viewed the Washington family's growing reputation with suspicion, and occasional visitors whose intentions weren't entirely benevolent. But Devon's abilities had grown sophisticated enough to sense malevolent spiritual energy, and the binding around the sweetgum tree provided protection that extended throughout Magnolia Park and the surrounding neighborhoods. "Bad people can't hide what they really are when they come here," Devon explained to a new family who had brought their daughter for guidance. "The energy around Grandma Celia's tree makes it so you can only be your real self." On this particular Sunday afternoon, exactly 6 months since the binding ceremony, Kendra found herself sitting in the same spot where she and Devon had first discovered the impossible cocoon. But now, instead of fear and confusion, she felt deep contentment and purpose. Devon was nearby, playing a complicated game with several other children whose families had joined their growing community. The game appeared to involve seeing and manipulating energy patterns that were invisible to most adults, and the laughter and excitement it generated spoke to the joy these children found in finally having peers who understood their unusual abilities. Aunt Florence sat beside Kendra on their favorite park bench, both women watching the children with the satisfaction of elders who had successfully guided the next generation through a difficult transition. "Ruby would be so proud," Aunt Florence said quietly, "not just of Devon, but of what you've built here. She always hoped that someday our family's gifts could be a source of connection rather than isolation." As the afternoon sun filtered through the leaves of the ancient sweetgum tree, Kendra could swear she caught a glimpse of Celia watching over the children with maternal pride. The guardian spirit was still bound to the tree, still carrying the responsibility she had accepted over a century ago. But she was no longer alone in that burden. Devon looked up from his game and smiled at his mother with the pure joy of a child who had found his place in the world. In his hand, he held a small stone that glowed with gentle light. Not one of the river stones from their ceremony, but something new he had discovered in the park's deeper woods. "Mama, I think the land is making new kinds of magic now," he said, approaching to show her his discovery. "Celia says it's because the shadow isn't fighting the good energy anymore. Everything can grow stronger and healthier." Kendra examined the glowing stone, feeling the warm pulse of benevolent spiritual energy it contained. Around them, other families were beginning to notice similar phenomena: flowers blooming out of season, wildlife behaving with unusual friendliness, an overall sense of peace and well-being that made Magnolia Park a place where people came, not just for recreation, but for healing. "What do you think it means?" she asked Devon. "I think it means we did more than just renew the binding," he said, with the wisdom that never failed to surprise her. "I think we transformed it into something better. Instead of just holding back the dark, we're helping the light shine brighter." As they packed up their afternoon picnic and prepared to walk home through streets that had become safer and more welcoming since the ceremony, Kendra reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. The quiet life she had built for Devon was gone forever, but in its place was something richer and more meaningful than she had ever imagined possible. They were no longer just a single mother and her gifted son, trying to navigate an unusual inheritance in isolation. They had become the center of a community of spiritual families who supported each other, learned from each other, and worked together to make their shared home a place where extraordinary gifts could flourish. The silver locket around her neck pulsed with gentle warmth as they reached their front door. And Kendra realized it was no longer a warning of supernatural danger, but a confirmation of spiritual harmony. The Washington family's role as guardians had evolved from containing darkness to nurturing light, from solitary vigilance to collaborative healing. Devon's journal entry that evening would record not just his observations about the growing spiritual energy in their community, but his dreams for the future, plans for teaching other young guardians, hopes for expanding their healing work, and the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly what he was meant to do with his life. And as Kendra tucked him into bed, listening to his excited plans for tomorrow's activities, she understood that they had achieved something precious beyond measure, a family legacy that was no longer a burden to be endured, but a gift to be celebrated and shared with anyone who needed healing guidance, or simply the comfort of knowing they weren't alone with their extraordinary abilities. The Guardian's vigil continued, but it was no longer a lonely watch. In the space where fear and duty had once lived, love and community had taken root and flourished.